This is The Catholic Current with Father Robert Mateig.
Boy, those emergency powers, apparently once you get a hold of them, you never want to let them go. Is that part of your concern, too, is that the bureaucracy is gearing up, seeing this as a matchless opportunity?
As a one target to point to, the emergency powers are the biggest thing. But if you could claw back the emergency powers from all of the governors and all of the county health officials, it's the true north, and we need to get rid of those. They make the case that this is no longer an emergent situation.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert Mateig of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. As always, let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, through the intercession of St. Ignatius Loyola, we ask that you pour forth your Holy Spirit upon us, a spirit of discernment, that we might hear your voice and obey your command. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, friends, you've heard me speak often about the importance of cultivating the moral imagination, and that's an important developmental milestone for young people. It's good for their intellect, it's good for their souls, and it's good for how they live. And one of the ways to form moral imagination is through literature, and that raises some challenges for people with a Catholic sensibility. There's a great deal of popularity in what I might call darker literature or horror literature. And I want to talk with an author who I think can teach us that actually a Catholic can afford and could benefit from reading, for lack of a better term, a darker fantasy. My returning guest is Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Santa Clara University. He's written the book, The Crucifix on Mecca's Front Porch. We're talking about his new novel called Providence Blue, A Fantasy Quest. Dr. David Pinault, welcome to the Catholic Current.
Thank you so much, Father. It's a great privilege to be here.
You know, David, I very much enjoyed reading your book. It was compelling. It's not beach reading. It required attention. It stimulated the imagination. Yet, if I were pressed against the wall and said, "Quick, what is the book about?" and don't give any spoilers, I would be hard pressed to meet those requirements. You know, as one of your reviewers said, this doesn't fit neatly into any category. How make the pitch for the book. What's it about, and what could its appeal be?
Well, thank you. This is a really good question. I did not write it to try to fit any genre in particular, but what I did try to do is to tell a story that I found compelling that basically involves something that all of us want, a second chance in life. Mm-hmm. And it's about characters who have made mistakes, really grievous mistakes, who are searching for redemption, who are experiencing considerable confusion in their life and in their direction, and in the end undertake quests to try to find spiritual guidance. That's sort of from a thematic point of view. And
right.
Then, of course, I'd be happy to describe the plot as well, if you like.
I just want to add another theme there. One of the things that I liked about the book is, you know, there were people who had been through some hard times, who made some, you know, objectively speaking, very bad choices. I didn't see a lot of self-pity. I didn't see a lot of giving up. Nearly all of the characters, when faced with a hard challenge, decided to do something about that. Am I reading that correctly, or have I missed it?
Yes, I think you have very much identified something very important, Father, because in this story, well, we can start. You see, there are multiple timelines that run through the story, but that intersect with each other. And at one level, you could say that this story is about several literary figures, authors who actually existed, whose lives intersect in my hometown of Providence, Rhode Island. And at one level, this novel is a kind of Valentine to the city where I grew up.
Right.
But in the research that I did for the story, what I did was to take a look, first of all, at the life of Robert E. Howard, who was a pulp action writer of the 1930s, who, for a number of reasons, partly having to do with tragedies in his own family and losing his mother and so forth, but primarily, and this is what I emphasize in the story, because of the fact that he felt himself sort of running out of inspiration to write. That comes out in some of the encounters that he had with friends. He winds up taking his own life, shooting himself, June 11th, 1936. And that's the opening scene in the story. But one of the things that is very important to this novel, Father, is as a Catholic, I believe, we believe as Christians that death is by no means the end. And what the novel pictures is a kind of afterworld journey. Now, since this is a fantasy, I take considerable imaginative liberties. And what I do is I build on the historical reality of his having shot himself, and I've looked at his correspondence and the relationships that he had, and build on that. One of his mentors had been H.P. Lovecraft, the notorious, famous, infamous horror writer of Providence, Rhode Island. And in the story, what happens is that H.P. Lovecraft ensorcels or captivates the soul of two authors who have died in tragic circumstances. One, Robert E. Howard, the pulp author I mentioned, and the other, Edgar Allan Poe, who's a more famous figure, known for poems like The Raven and numerous stories like The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Poe was somebody who frequently traveled. This was in the 1840s, another time stratum in the story. Poe had frequently traveled from Baltimore up to Providence because he was romantically involved with a woman who was probably the greatest transcendentalist poet of the early 19th century, Sarah Helen Whitman. And Poe and Sarah Helen Whitman would meet for their romantic assignations in one of the oldest libraries in continuous existence in the United States, the Providence Athenaeum, which happens to be a library that I frequented when I was a teen. And so H.P. Lovecraft, I found out, often would go to the Athenaeum to study and to write. And so part of what the novel features is kind of a strong sense of place. I make use of the Athenaeum in the story. So what Lovecraft does is, in the story, is to ensorcel or magically bind the souls of Robert E. Howard, who shot himself, and Edgar Allan Poe, who basically drank himself to death in the gutters of Baltimore, and sends them off on a quest into the remote past to the Egypt of the pharaohs for the purpose of bringing back certain magical artifacts that will serve Lovecraft's purposes. So that's sort of a first pass at some of the things that take place in the story.
Okay. Friends, I'm speaking with David Pinault. He is Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Santa Clara University. We're talking about his new novel called Providence Blue, a fantasy quest, and we're asking about Catholics reading darker horror and fantasy literature. David, one of the things that struck me about the book was a sense of ongoing struggle. No one in the novel had it easy. Everyone has a wound, a regret, a shame, but you don't leave it there. It's not, we all died miserable, the end. Was that, did you make that choice because you're a storyteller or because you're a Catholic storyteller?
I think primarily because of being a Catholic storyteller. If someone were to say to me, David, identify a prayer that has shaped much of your consciousness and spiritual orientation, I would say the Salve Regina, something that I grew up with very young, and, turn then, most gracious advocate, thine eyes of mercy towards us, and after this our exile show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. And so, yes, our ultimate home is in heaven, but we're here for a purpose. We're here to serve. We are essentially pilgrims. But as the prayer mentions, we do a fair amount of mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. So, we don't expect as Christians, as Catholics, life to be easy, okay? But as pilgrims, we're not supposed to get immobilized by our pains. We're supposed to keep moving. We have a destination. We have a larger destiny. And there's a sense of movement, I hope, this is what I intended at least, throughout the story. People are struggling, they fall down, they make mistakes, but they do the best they can, even in their afterlife, to try to make good for the mistakes that they made. And I also try to emphasize very strongly the notion that even in our weakness and our sinfulness, we can help each other.
See, I think that is tremendously important. There is a sense of a kind of church suffering and church militant at work here. And I don't want to give away too much, glimpses of a church triumphant as well. So in that context, I think the novel that you've written, while drawing upon surprising sources, is a very, very Catholic novel indeed. Friends, we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. David Pinault. We're talking about his new book called Providence Blue, a fantasy quest. We're asking about, may a Catholic read with prophet some darker horror and fantasy literature? Remember, our rallying cry here at the Catholic Current is Christus Mundo, Mundus Christo, bringing Christ to the world and the world to Christ. We do it because our Lord says so, for the greater glory of God, the love of our neighbor, and the salvation of our own soul. After the broadcast today, go to the stationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Everything you need to take this conversation to your family and friends we give to you. Together, we can take it around the world. We certainly cannot do it without you. Let's get busy. We'll be right back. Stay with us. This is Jesuit Father Robert McTague, your daily host of the Catholic Current. Join me on Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern, and we'll meet Thomas Jacoby of Ignatius Press. We'll be talking about lessons to be learned from how saints die. And there will be a special surprise in the last segment of the show. You don't want to miss it. That's the Catholic Current on Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern, coming to you from the Station of the Cross and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
You're listening to the Catholic Current with Father Robert McTague from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Stay connected with the show, our guests and topics, by following the show on Twitter and Gab. Just search for The Catholic Current.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us in the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. We're talking about literature today. We're talking about, can a Catholic read with prophet darker horror and fantasy literature? My guest today is Dr. David Pinault. He's Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Sarah Clown University. We're talking about his new fascinating novel called Providence Blue, a fantasy quest. David, as a boy, I like to read thrilling literature, and for me, even now, the formula of good guys with swords fighting bad guys is a formula that's hard to improve on. So growing up, I read Robert Howard. I read the Conan the Barbarian stories, which weren't two-dimensional stories. There was more substance to it than you might glean from watching the movies from the 80s. Fafford and the Grey Mouser by Fritz Lieber. I read that whole series. The Drow series with R.A. Salvatore. I'm well disposed towards a rollicking adventure, a call to heroism, facing down evil, etc. And I can understand why Robert Howard might appeal. But boy, H.P. Lovecraft, I've tried, at least with his short stories, and it just seems horrible black squid monsters from the other dimension are trying to break into our world, and the best outcome is to be eaten first rather than suffer. I don't know that he would not have been my candidate for a resource for a novel. Tell us why you chose him.
Okay, that's a really, really appropriate question, because, in fact, simply taken on his own, I would not recommend H.P. Lovecraft. However, in a sense, the novel represents a reckoning with my own past. He's very much a Providence writer, he set his stories in the streets, in the houses, on the cobblestone boulevards that I knew from when I grew up. And, and I started writing stories when I was about 9, maybe earlier, And so when I found out that here was a local author, probably the best known Rhode Islander in terms of fiction of the 20th century, of course I wanted to investigate him, and especially because I knew the locales. And there was a kind of fascination to him. I didn't fully understand it. There was a lot, even when I was a teen, that I found repellent. And then as I got a little older, and my sense of myself as a Catholic only deepened, I really found him repellent. But nonetheless, there he was in my past. And in fact, traveling around the country, even for a time living in France, I found that H.P. Lovecraft, it was quite a vogue for him in France, and people would sort of ask me for an accounting. What is it with him anyways? And what I've come to realize is that the worldview he offers is one that I find ultimately destructive, but I felt that I wanted to talk back to it. And I guess what I would say is that even bad literature can sometimes be a source of benefit if one is sort of armed with a kind of perspective that allows one to read against the grain. And let me explain that a little bit more fully. You see, his worldview ultimately posits that there is no benevolent presence in our world, that instead the galaxies are populated by Cthulhu and his ilk. Cthulhu is the term that he uses for these sort of alien, interstellar, quasi-gods, figures that are at best indifferent to us, at worst hostile. They try to break in from time to time on our world to do horrible things to us. It's a worldview that in many ways is essentially Gnostic, in the idea of a worldview that promises secret knowledge available only to a certain elite. And it's a worldview that posits that our world is essentially bad, and that the creator of the world is someone who doesn't wish us well. So it's not only anti-Christian, I would say it's anti-cosmic. And what I wanted to do in this story was to basically put this worldview into contention with the Catholic Christian worldview, which runs completely counter to it. Because as Catholic Christians, we believe that this world ultimately is good because it is created by a God who loves us, and that we're put in this world to help each other, to know love and serve God, and then to return to him as pilgrims, as I said before. So in a sense, I completely agree with you that, Lovecraft is not an appealing figure, but because as a Rhode Islander fascinated with fiction to begin with, I wanted to grapple with this. And that sort of brings us back to this whole genre of horror. If someone were to say to me, what is horror all about as a genre, I would point to the fact that, horror really, grew up out of the Romanticism movement of the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And in many ways, it's sort of a substitute for religion, or maybe better put, it's a secularized version of religion. With my students, I've always said that all of us ultimately are religious because all of us instinctively seek the holy. And by the holy, that's a kind of generic word for that which gives order and pattern and meaning to our life. As Christians, we call the holy God. Okay? And what horror does is horror promises a revelation, just as all religions do. It promises a revelation of the true nature of the world. And that really sort of grows out of the Romantic movement, because the Romantic movement basically reacting against organized social structures, including acting against organized religion. The Romantics felt that they could basically achieve that connection with the divine on their own by being sufficiently sensitive enough.
See, that's a key thing, I think, and it runs throughout your novel, is the idea of self-will. And, I preach very often, and I talk about this in Spiritual Direction, about one of the greatest lies from hell is that we're spiritual orphans, that we're abandoned, that we're unprovided for, we're on our own, but the darkness is willing to cut a deal with us. And that can be powerfully seductive, and of course, ultimately, it's absolutely destructive. It's idolatrous. It can't possibly have a happy ending in any sense of the word. It is part of the appeal of literature, of that darker horror literature, is that it gives us permission to suspect that there are things just under the surface, that there's more to life than just the flat surface. I know you mentioned several times in the novel, Lovecraft had a story about the rats in the wall and knowing where they are. Yeah. So yes, there is a dark stream that lies underneath, but that's nested in a context, we believe, as Catholics, of a providential God, of a good God. Where does horror literature fit into that Catholic worldview?
Well, here's the thing. I think if we approach horror as Catholic Christians, we become sensitized, first of all, to what's the instinctive appeal or allure of horror. And that is, as I said, the promise of revelation, that the promise of holding out a key to unlock the nature of the world, that is, what lies beyond the apparent surface of things. And that's why I see horror as instinctively religious. However, there are better and worse forms of religion, aren't there?
Well, yes.
And I would say the tough thing for young people today, and in many ways, I mean this novel to be for people of all ages, but I can see a couple of interviewers have said to me, I'm going to put the young people in my life into contact with this novel. And, and I think that there's something to that, because for young people especially, and again, all of us are religious, but young people are living in a world of infinite distractibility, being pulled about by 500 different, TV channels and social media apps and all the rest of it. And yet everyone still has this spiritual hunger. Horror, of course, promises revelation with the big pow, it cuts through all those distractions and sort of grabs you by the collar and drags you in, so it's very, very powerful. So part of what I do in the story is to depict, in the present day stratum of the novel, taking place in the 21st century, there are a number of individuals who are drawn towards the Lovecraftian worldview because of that, what I would call ultimately religious allure. And what they basically find is that the kind of worldview offered by Lovecraftian horror is inadequate.
Right.
And what they ultimately become exposed to is a larger, warmer, and loving world presided over by the God whom we know in the Catholic tradition.
Is part of the tug of horror literature that it's a way of dealing with human insufficiency? You don't have to be alive very long to realize you just can't get by on your own. And now that could lead you to just roll over and die, try to be a good victim, commit suicide, try to gain power over others, or recognize that we live in a world created in love and for love, and we are provided for. Talk a bit, we've got about a minute and a half left here in this segment, about human insufficiency in relation to darker literature.
Yes, exactly. Well, the thing is that so many of us, this has always been the risk to some extent, but especially nowadays, so many of us live in isolation. And precisely because of the proliferation of social media, it's very easy for us to become immured in our own worlds. And so, horror offers this sense of connecting us to a larger reality. And reading, of course, is basically a one-on-one experience. And so the risk of reading something like horror is that it can increase our isolation. what I try to do is to turn horror on its head, and as someone gets drawn into it, open them out towards a larger Catholic Christian worldview.
See, I think that is tremendously important. We've got people whose senses and therefore imagination and memory is being flooded by electronic sewage, to use a poetic turn of phrase.
Well said.
And that's not good for us. And we can't make ourselves blind or deaf, but we do have to be discerning consumers. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. David Pinault. He's Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Santa Clara University. We're talking about Catholics looking at darker horror and fantasy literature. We're talking about his new fascinating novel called Providence Blue, A Fantasy Quest. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Wherever you can find audio, you can find us. Download the audio, follow us on your favorite channel, write a 5-star review. We need to attract the attention of the algorithm so that these conversations get the attention they deserve. We'll work together, and together we'll take it around the world. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us.
This is The Catholic Current from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Catch up on an episode you've missed or share them with your family or friends. The Catholic Current is podcasted wherever you enjoy listening: Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. Today is a literary episode here at the Catholic Current. We're asking whether a Catholic can, with profit, read darker horror and fantasy literature. My guest today is Dr. David Pinault. He's Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Santa Clara University. We're talking about his fascinating new novel called Providence Blue, a fantasy quest. David, I've seen a fair number of B-level fantasy and horror movies, and at some point the question of good and evil comes up, and the wisdom figure says, well, you can't really have good without evil. The two go together, and then my head explodes. Because good, for it to be really good, has to be triumphant, and it has to be sufficient. It can have no lack. So good doesn't need evil. Evil, in the classical sense, is a privation of good. It doesn't make anything of its own. It's parasitic upon creation, upon goodness. And the dualism that we see, going all the way back to the Manichees and St. Augustine, and then I think with someone like H.P. Lovecraft is that that really evil does triumph, or better said, nothingness triumphs. Was it Ernest Nagel who said, human life is an episode between two oblivions. In the beginning there was nothing, the nothing exploded, now there's us, and eventually there'll be nothing again. So how shall we pass our time? Well, we might as well just try to gain advantage over each other for the sake of pleasure. And I think that's the lure of evil in that context, of that Gnostic. You can get the Necronomicon and, pass your passing time here pleasantly, rather than, so in other words, eat or be eaten. Catholicism intrudes into that narrative and says something very different. What is that difference?
Well, I think the difference here, and I'll talk about this from a storyteller's point of view, the difference is that the story told by the Catholic tradition is very different, and it starts with a couple of key motifs. First of all, the notion that there is what the Jesuit Ryan Dunn's Milwaukee Marquette describes as the elemental goodness of being, and when we talk about being with a capital B, the ground out of which everything comes. Okay, in other words, Catholicism is radical in its sense of emphasizing this notion of goodness And that goodness exists in the world because of our Creator. And it goes beyond that, too, because of the fact that we are also gifted with freedom, that we are able to choose. God did not create this world for us simply to be slaves.
Right.
And so, of course, that gives us the freedom, to fail and to slip as well. And part of what the story does in Providence Blue, and again, I promised I was going to talk about this from a storyteller's point of view, so here I go, that it's not only creatures of flesh and blood from the Catholic Christian worldview who are able to choose. The novel is also, one friend asked me, okay, in just a few words, what can you say about Providence Blue? And I said, well, it involves a lot of angels and archeology.
There's an element of the Raiders of the Lost Ark there. There's hidden manuscripts. There's traveling to different times and places there. I mean, if you're sympathetic to that kind of exercise in the imagination, it really is a very rich tapestry.
Yes, thank you. And so, in any case, I try to have the novel talk back to the Lovecraftian worldview by emphasizing that fundamental goodness of the world. And without spoiling the story too much, I'll just mention that the angels, too, are caught up in the quest, so to speak. Right. And all of us can make mistakes. All of us can experience repentance and try to do what we can, to make it good, to make each other whole. And I would say that, when it comes to our choices of entertainment, there's a sense in which there's nothing that's merely neutral. In other words, one of our responsibilities in this world is to try to make the best use of our time we can. And that extends also to our entertainment. And so given the fact that horror has such an allure, especially for many young people, one of the things that I try to do in the story is to take that well-known entertainment genre and turn it into a Catholic resource so that people who might not otherwise want to look at a book that has a label Catholic or Christian attached to it might find themselves drawn in and perhaps recognize in the story and in its characters feelings that they can identify with. In other words, there are a number of individuals in the story. I'll take one person. His nickname is Tagger, Alex Finsterness, and that name was not chosen by accident because finsterness is the German word for darkness. And he is someone who is very much tempted and drawn to the dark side. And but in the story, even though he for a while spins helplessly, really, in the Lovecraftian orbit, he begins to find a way to pull free by the end of the story. So I make sure that the characters in the stories are recognizable, especially to young people.
Right.
He himself happens to be a graffiti artist, okay, and undergoes struggles, falls, and with the help of others is able to rise again. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that I regard my use of the horror genre not simply as an accident, but something I'm trying to make very positive use of.
Right. Friends, I'm speaking today with Dr. David Pinault. He's Professor of Emeritus Religious Studies at Santa Clara University. We're talking about whether a Catholic can, with profit, read darker horror and fantasy literature, and we're talking about his important and fascinating novel called Providence Blue, a fantasy quest. David, what you described in a certain sense is almost sounds like you're a Jesuit missionary. The hallmark of the classical Jesuit missionaries was enter through their door, lead them through yours. So, Matteo Ricci learned how to speak and dress like a Chinese Mandarin. Francis Xavier realized if he went out in rags as a good Western religious, he'd be ignored. So he had to present himself as a courtier for the emperor, etc. I think the trouble with a lot of Catholics working in culture, especially with younger people, is they enter through their door and then they stay there. You have a sense of where you want them, where you want the reader to go. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next segment. I want to go back to Robert Howard and the tragedy of his suicide. And his most famous literary creation is Conan the Barbarian, and Conan's girlfriend is Valeria. And she keeps asking him at key points, "Do you want to live forever?" And I remember reading it. I don't know if you've seen this too, but Robert Howard was very devoted to his mother, who was sickly. And he promised her that when she died, he would die too. And I think she died of tuberculosis, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
and then he killed himself shortly after. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. For my purposes in the story, what I also draw on is the fact that I don't know if the name Noveline Price comes back to you, but Noveline was a school teacher, a historical figure, who knew Robert E. Howard in Texas. They dated for a while. They were friends. They knew each other for some time. And what happened was that he would frequently talk to her because they shared an interest in writing and in literature. She was a school teacher. And, and he a number of times described himself to her as basically used up. He would say, "I am in my sere and yellow leaf now. I'm just about finished." And he was 30 years old, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he felt used up, and the sense that I've gotten from looking at her memoir of their relationship and a number of his writings was that yes, part of his emotional challenge had to do with his closeness to his parents, especially his mom. And her approaching death. But there was also a sense in which he really did not know how to proceed further in life. And for me, one of the best ways to understand the psyche of Robert E. Howard is through his short novel, Almeric. And in the novel, it opens with the protagonist's name is Esau, Karen, and Esau is a kind of outlaw figure, and he's being pursued by the police unjustly, as it turns out, but nonetheless he's being hunted all over the planet. And finally he comes upon a scientist who has a kind of 1930s style interstellar space launch cannon, and he blasts the protagonist like a bullet off into interstellar space. And I've often thought, of course, that for Robert E. Howard is a kind of way of talking about his own death. In fact, I have known people in my own life who have struggled with the temptation of suicide, who have literally said to me that they were drawn to the idea of doing themselves in hope that whatever was on the other side of the bullet would be, preferable to this, or at least different. So it was a temptation that he struggled with, and I think that, in a sense, he tried to keep that darkness at bay through the writing, and as the writing dried up, he became more and more susceptible to the darkness. And in the novel, part of what I do is explore those motifs, the temptation to give up, and sort of map the afterlife, because I am a strong believer as a Catholic in the concept of purgatory, and we can never prejudge where anyone goes after they die. I mean, the Church will say with confidence that certain people we call saints are in heaven, but the Church never pre-condemns anyone to hell, no matter what they've done. Mm-hmm. And so purgatory, in both a figurative and a literal sense, plays a large role in the story.
Well, I thought of Tolkien's short story called Leaf by Niggle, which is ultimately a very great meditation on purgatory as well. I like the idea of second chances, and I think part of the appeal of the novel is people are so distracted by things that lure them to the surface and mere appearances. Everything is merely pixels, merely virtual. And I think this book drags you beyond the appearances to what appears, to the roots of what appears. And I think that can be the basis of prayer and conversion, to say, if I don't live superficially anymore, then what is there for me? And I want to start with that in the next segment. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. David Pinault. He is Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Santa Clara University. We're talking today about whether a Catholic can, with profit, read darker horror and fantasy literature, and we're discussing his fascinating new novel called Providence Blue, A Fantasy Quest. Be part of the conversation. Follow what we're following by following us on Gab. That's gab.com. Our channel is The Catholic Current. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Everything you need to take this conversation to your family and friends that we give to you. Together, we can take it around the world. We can do it with you. We cannot do it without you. We can get started today. We're back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us. This is Jesuit Father Robert McTague, your daily host for the Catholic Current. Join me on Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern for our special Friday format. We'll start with Let's Talk About This, where we walk through a complex issue together. We'll be talking about censoring the obvious, how the state and media propaganda can make you doubt common sense about gender, health, and children. We'll wrap up with weekend readiness to prepare you for Sunday Mass. Join me on Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern for the Catholic Current, coming to you from the Station of the Cross and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
After today's broadcast, go to the Catholic Current show page on thestationofthecross.com for info on today's guests, the show resource links, and to sign up for our weekly email of upcoming shows.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current. We bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. My guest today is Dr. David Pinault. He is Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Santa Clara University. We're talking about his new novel called Providence Blue, A Fantasy Quest. David, I want to look at two different ways of approaching literature. I used to work with a lot of college-age kids, homeschooled. Some of them came from great backgrounds, some not so much. From the not so much spectrum, where especially young ladies, as a father, I spent most of my life reading novels about some girl on the plains in Kansas, thinking deep thoughts about the merits of family life while churning butter. And nothing happened. On the other hand is the very dark literature of H.P. Lovecraft. And I think of Nietzsche, who was a madman and a genius, who said, if you look into the abyss long enough, the abyss looks back into you. I think of C.S. Lewis in reflecting on the Screwtape Letters, which is one of my favorite works of his. And he said he found it really oppressive to write that book, and he was glad when he was done with it, because he was spending so much time contemplating evil and darkness. That said, what are the benefits or dangers of Catholic approaching darker fantasy and horror literature?
Well, I think, again, a great question, Father. And I would say that one has to choose one's fiction wisely. Right. This goes back to something we were talking about earlier, namely that the use of our time is not merely neutral or indifferent. And right. So that applies to our entertainments as well. And that's why I was saying that if one approaches Lovecraft on one's own, it's necessary to read him against the grain, that is, to talk back to him and to say, no, actually, that isn't so. And because as someone who happened to grow up in Lovecraft's hometown of Providence, I'd been exposed to him early, so to speak, in my omnivorous reading in the public library, what I wanted to do as an adult was to have that conversation of talking back to him and saying, hey, wait a minute, fella, there's more to the world than what you posit.
Right.
And so I would say that, the argument of Providence Blue is that although the Lovecraft cosmos can be alluring, that actually the Catholic Christian worldview offers a response that allows us to realize, no, actually Lovecraft is wrong. The benefit of exploring this, I would say, in fiction is that it allows one to address fears and doubts that we have and come up with positive, constructive answers to them. By presenting this in the form of entertainment, I'm hoping to draw in a larger readership. In other words, one can be attracted to a novel like Providence Blue because one thinks of it simply as entertainment. And so I'm hoping to reach a larger audience than I might have otherwise if I had simply written a nonfiction work called An Introduction to the Catholic Christian Sacramental Worldview. No.
Right. That might be alluring for someone like me, but I'm not necessarily a representative sample of anything. Again, I don't have it at my fingertips. There's a wonderful quote from C.S. Lewis that said, "Given that there are real dangers in the world, please let children know that there are knights and heroes and people who can resist evil." And I think that is so important. I remember as a college kid, going to some prayer service, we were asked to pray for our so-called enemies. And I got really angry, and I said, if we don't have real spiritual enemies who don't want us dead and don't want us damned to hell, then the cross is just a bit of melodrama on Christ's part, and we can ask him to dial it back, which I think is which is part of the temptation of modernism in Catholicism.
Yes, that's exactly right. And unfortunately, many well-meaning individuals in the world today, including in our contemporary Western society, they become essentially fatigued by the notion that there are not only alternative worldviews out there in the world, but there are also alternative worldviews that actively don't wish us well and that are actively hostile, actually, to the Catholic Christian way of understanding. And we need to be able to fortify ourselves in our beliefs and in the stories we tell ourselves. I mean, we nourish ourselves with stories.
Yes.
And because I think it's actually very, very, very dangerous to go through life naively thinking that if there are any differences, it's only because of a simple misunderstanding. No, I mean, it's there's a German expression, stark auch im Irren, okay? Strong even when wrong, and it's true. I mean,
sure. Don't underestimate the power
out there. I mean, this is a whole other discussion in itself.
Don't underestimate the powers of stupid people acting in large groups. I mean, that's certainly true as well. I liked what you said about reading against the grain. I try to teach students especially in the historical philosophy classes I taught, it's not just enough to read first Plato and then Aristotle. You've got to read them both and then get them talking to each other. And you've got to be able to argue with the author. And I think in some ways you certainly argue with H.P. Lovecraft. So if you were going to take on, I don't know, say H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, Dean Koontz, who are the literary figures you'd want in your gang to take on those darker figures?
Well, I would say, first of all, I mean, some are obvious. I mean, I really love the richly Catholic worldview of J.R.R. Tolkien, for example.
Yes.
But that's a figure that everyone has heard of. But I would say, in terms of a Catholic author who acknowledges the darkness we have to struggle with, I would also want to include Flannery O'Connor. Mm-hmm. She's not an easy read.
No. But
she is someone and she struggled in her own life very much, including with physical suffering and debilities. But she's someone who is, really sort of definitely worth our attention. And I think that what we really need to do is to be able to say to ourselves, okay, we are not alone in these stories, that because I think we really sort of live by story and we live by narrative, and we need to feel that we're not alone, that the stories that we tell are ones that are more deeply rooted. I think that's why Tolkien described us as sub-creators. In other words, the originator of the stories, ultimately, that's God, and we do the best that we can to imitate God in the stories that we tell. And I think that's a very, very important point for us to keep in mind.
Oh, no, that is tremendously, tremendously rich. I've tried my hand at fiction from time to time, not in the least bit successfully, but I find the idea of that world creation, that to have a language and a history and a theology and so on, and it begins to make you wonder the type of care, the type of attention that God invested in us. And I know when I taught medical ethics, and students were astounded that it turns out health and science were actually on the side of Catholic revelation. I'd say, hey, you almost think that someone intelligent was behind it all. David Pinault, thank you for your fascinating new book, Providence Blue, A Fantasy Quest. I look forward to reading more of your work, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you so much, Father. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you.
I'm Jesuit Father Robert McTighe, your host here every day at the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. We're trying to recover the lost art of intelligent conversation and apply timeless truths to timely topics. After the broadcast today, go through thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcasts. Through the intercession of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, may God our Lord surround you with a legion of guardian angels with flaming swords to light your path, to keep you from all harm and every evil, to reach the happiness of heaven. May mighty God bless you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Go in peace, and please pray for me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by thestationofthecross.com, a listener-funded nonprofit organization. Please prayerfully consider donating at thestationofthecross.com by calling 1-877-888-6279 or through our free iCatholic Radio mobile app.